Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making your way to the art gallery. I would like to begin by thanking the Women's Center and the Art Gallery at Eastern for this invitation to facilitate a meaningful conversation around women and war. The last time I was at Eastern was in 2012 as a part of my senior capstone, which I invited women of color to reflect on their art practices. So this feels like a full circle moment for me, and I now realize I just revealed my age. I am 33. To start, February 24th, the world watched as Russia invaded Ukraine, denying their independence in fear of the potential allyship with Western powers. For the rest of the world, we acknowledge this war as the beginning this year. But for the citizens of Ukraine, this conflict began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. For us in the US, there is a dislocation of facts, but this exhibition and conversation is an attempt to build a connection. It is interesting, and I must note, a privilege to engage in a conversation about war. I say both a privilege and interesting because while the US has initiated wars in foreign lands, a war has not taken place on US soil since 1865, when the Civil War ended over 150 years ago. US citizens often do not have to deal with the aftermath of war. For example, the works in the show depict displacement and women who have made makeshift dwellings to protect their families, women highlighting their efforts to avoid the rain shower of shellings on a daily basis, and the gender-based violence they encounter in the name of war. I hope that this conversation over the next hour will allow for a more expansive conversation about war and its reverberations. The works by the 12 contemporary Ukrainian women artists featured in this exhibition, Women at War, curated by Monika Fabjanski, will serve as a platform for today's discussion addressing issues of gender, war, power, silences, violence, and memory. At this time, I would like to welcome our panelist. And I do want to acknowledge Hasna Samadi, who was supposed to be with us today, but for unfortunate reasons could not attend today. And they were coming from the Collective of Refugee Immigrant Women, based in Connecticut, and also Sanctuary Kitchen, which is ran through IRIS, Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services. In addition to Hasna, who I mentioned cannot be here, we are joined by photographer, artist, educator, and advocate, Luciana Quagliato McClure. Luciana is a motivator of social change through artistic expression and activism. She is the founding organizer of the Nasty Woman movement in Connecticut. Through her work, she unites communities, amplifies the voices of minorities, and raises resources for countless organizations throughout Connecticut while utilizing the arts. I have prepared some questions for Luciana, and I will save some time in the end and open up the floor for questions. But before we start with the questions, I do want to turn it over to Luciana to talk more about their work that they do here in Connecticut.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm honored to be here, especially because I've watched the curator when she first started putting these exhibitions together. So I've watched from afar, watched it taking shape in New York City, and now it's really beautiful to see here in Connecticut. I think our community is very lucky to see this. So I'm not from Connecticut. I'm from Brazil. And I never thought I would live here. I didn't speak English. I never heard of Connecticut before. And now I've been here longer than I've lived in Brazil. In a way, this is home right now. I am a mother. I have 2 small children. I'm also a professor. I teach here in Connecticut at Connecticut College and also at Southern Connecticut State University. Photographer. I do a lot of documentary work, and I've been running the Nasty Woman Collective for the last 6 years now. And oddly enough, we can actually, I always talk about how we cannot separate our lives from, from events that happen and how activism or how, change impact our lives. Sometimes it cannot, everyone has heard this, the personal is political. It very much is. You cannot separate those things either. And I discovered that, in 2016 when, our entire political climate changed. And at the same time, my personal life had changed. I was getting divorced, and there I was, an artist, a mother with 2 children, and suddenly feeling that I'm caught in the middle of this political change, and which meant that everything that my family had worked for could have changed forever. I feel lucky to be in this kind of dialogue, as I see a lot of this exhibition as bridging that political and the personal, and how do we make it visible through works of art.
Thank you. So my first question, I looked at an interview that Monica did, and in the interview they spoke about how the show was meant to center the women experiencing the war, how they see it and how they record it. So my question for you is, in your work as a photographer and an advocate, how do you center the woman's experience around political violence?
Well, I think so. I think there are a couple of things in the question. One, how do we understand violence? And I think violence is not always something that clear to us. I think we experience violence in so many different ways. And even political violence, to some of us, it means that's all we know. That's like part of our existence of how we have known to navigate the world. And at other times, it only happens through your experience, sometimes from leaving home and moving to a new place, which is what happened when I moved here in the United States. But through photography, I really think about, I center my work around the voice, my own voice, but also the voice of other women. And I mainly do that through actually more organizing than my own photography. My photography is very much centered on motherhood and breaking down stereotypes and representations of motherhood that have been centered around misconceptions, stereotypes, and I try to break those through my own experience, but also shifting the narrative that, as women being powerless and being not having any sense of agency. So really shifting that and inviting it to change the gaze, how we're looking at mothers, how we're looking at a single mother, how we're looking at a single mother that it's not just a mother, that has many identities, both being Latin, both being queer, both being a professor, being an artist. So I think so much of my work as a photographer is really returning to this question of how sometimes some political frameworks, they like to use one of our identities to really penalize us, but also as a form of cage. Once you're one thing, you cannot be anything else. So I try to break that thinking from the work that I do as a photographer.
Thank you. So you talk about breaking away outside, getting outside of the box. So my next question is, as we think about how women resist in many ways, in many realms, whether it's the domestic, the public, or diasporic fear, what has been your experience?
I think as realizing that, silence or it's not an option, through a lot of what I do. I think, and it's almost like echoing a little bit of Audre Lorde's work, our silence will not protect us. And it's funny how we don't realize those things until you're in situations where you don't have a choice. You need to survive. And I think survival allows you to suddenly challenge the things you were told that you cannot do, you cannot be, you cannot, you cannot change. And I think through the last 6 years in doing community organizing work and activism, one thing that I've learned is that, women are fierce, women are strong. And once they get together, they can change anything. And I've seen them do it. And I feel incredibly lucky to be able to create platforms, through the arts to really engage with other women artists, but also women that don't even call themselves artists. So even through our organizing work, we don't say sometimes just artists. We call them makers. We call them thinkers, shakers, and because sometimes we, and I think it goes back to identity. Sometimes we don't even understand where we're at, but we want to be heard. And I think one of the ways of challenging things, it is to think about, well, what is it that I can do? How can I change something? And to realize that, sometimes you just don't have a choice. And I think when you talk about the domestic sphere, I think through the pandemic, I think there are many women that, they were still working. They were also caring for their children, and they were teaching them at home, and they were caring for one another, for family members. And I think in the domestic framework, especially, I always think how overlooked that is. How we are not appreciating, how we're resisting daily by caring for one another. And if we're not doing that kind of work, we cannot even begin to get out of these spaces they're trying to contain us.
Mm-hmm. Through your own personal experience, do you think, or did you find yourself kind of connecting with women during the pandemic? And I don't know, I guess give certain examples of ways that you've resisted kind of the position that a lot of mothers were put in during the last 2 years?
I went back to grad school. That's one thing I did. I went to grad school, and for many reasons. One, because I realized so much of the work that I was already doing with community organizing, doing exhibitions, mobilizing, collaborating with other communities, it always returned to this idea of the stories that we're told. Who's telling those stories? What are the voices that we're listening? What are the voices we're not listening enough? And I realized that, that goes back to returning to the classroom, goes back to returning to academic spaces, to spaces of where discourse should be happening, where we should be challenging the histories that we're giving, the stories that are being told. And, in relation to that, I think about how this exhibition, is about how do we listen to women's voices through war, and how often we're not listening to women's voices. And I think that's a big problem, because it shows not only how, we are not caring to listen to what they have to say, but also what is the narrative that we're creating, Recently, I saw another exhibition, and it was She Who Tells a Story, which was Iranian women artists too. And it was, again, it's challenging, these war narratives, these stories that we're told. And it's we only hear from men, or we hear from media news, but we're not listening from women that are surviving. They're surviving on ground, by making sure that their children are alive, making sure that they are alive, making sure that they are not that they're fighting with everything they have, because there is no other option but to survive. And I think we cannot even sometimes begin to comprehend, what is it like to feel that you don't have time to think, but because you can only have to act.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So that last question thought more broadly about women and resistance, but I want to narrow in and think more specifically about mothering, which you kind of brought up. So in thinking about mothering and resistance, what is the cost to motherhood in this context?
I've been thinking a lot about that lately, especially right now, as we think, here in the United States, as we're living in a post-Roe v. Wade era, right? Which is suddenly, again, shifts the idea, how do we think about motherhood? How do we think about women? How do we think about wars? How do we think about women's bodies? How do we think about bodies? They're used, to hurt, to create more violence, to create more trauma, and to not allow for hope, for love, or for reimagining what happens next. So I think the role of women and mothers in this context, I think, is really important because they are, I was looking at a photograph on the corner and of the two children at the bottom of the stairs. And I think those are such strong images because also it's an image of survival, it's an image of hope, it's an image of war, it's an image of trauma, but it's also like what happens now and what do we do once we are aware of these images, once we're aware that, this kind of violence is being created. I think so often we think of mothers as not fighters, but so much of mothers outside of the, heteronormative white narrative, motherhood is a form of survival, it's a form of resistance, and sometimes it's fighting for the right to be a mother. But I think in a war context, suddenly you're put at that, at that space where you have to survive, but you also need to care. You also need to make sure that you are, doing so much at the same time. And I get like a little overwhelmed thinking about it.
Thank you for that. I think even as you were talking, I think about, so previously I was at Brown University at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And so a lot of my work is thinking about this history, its legacies, and what does it look like around the world. And so the Brown brothers were really good at collecting and keeping record of everything, and collecting pieces that really speak to the history of the Americas. And there is this one image that is ingrained in my head that I don't think I will ever forget. But it is a depiction of a slave ship. And if you look really closely in the corner, there is a figure who you can tell is pregnant and is actively giving birth. And even thinking about kind of the slave trade, there is a constant thought about the loss of life, right? But it never occurred to me as a woman or as now a mom what it meant to give birth during something as traumatic as the slave trade. And so I think even as you highlighted the image of the two small kids, which is another image in this exhibition that stood out to me as well, what does it mean to give life during war, which is so much about the loss of life.
Yeah, no, and I think about, I remember when I first became a mother, and it was 2012, and I was shopping in a store, and I was clearly very pregnant, and this woman looks at me and she said, "Oh, you're gonna have a child? I could never do that in this world." And I didn't know how to feel about it. And I keep thinking about this, I always do. What does it mean to bring a child in a world where there is so much violence? But the thing is, that is, part of me, that's not the focus, because I think I think that's exactly what they want us to think, and I don't want to live a life in fear. I don't want my children to live a life in fear. My children had, for the first time, my youngest experienced like a drill in school. And in my mind, I'm thinking like, this is so different. Like a shooting drill. So I am like, should I have had children? Should I have not had children? But then this is exactly why I do this work. This is why I teach women's and gender studies. This is why I teach about intersectional thinking. This is why I do community organizing, because, I think we can sit and I think we should sit, we should mourn, but I think we should also fight.
For me, I think that's part of that resistance as a woman and as a mother is, how do I imagine and think of a world for my son that doesn't exist? So it's very much a part of like my thinking and the work that I do on a daily basis.
Right, and even like I remember reading one of the articles when the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and it was give us poetry, and that's the thing. It's like I think about the power that the arts have, the power that hope has to imagine what we can do to fight, and to just not, stay put, to not be complacent, to not stay silent, because there will always be violence. There's violence every day happening. There are wars happening, but wars that we're not aware of, because we're here. So to think that, that's a reason for us to stop living, to stop dreaming, I don't think that's where it's at, And I think we have to understand how do we stop wars? How do we understand what we can do here in our communities? How we can also be aware of what's happening in other countries, and the role that we play into that.
So this next question, family is really important to me, as you can tell. I'm thinking about my own family, and I'm thinking about the civil rights movement. So at the beginning of the movement, adults were at the forefront of the organizing, of the resistance, but with jobs and housing at risk, there is this shift that happens in the movement where the young people come into the forefront because they have less to lose. And so as someone who has taught this history, and I've had the opportunity to meet many veterans and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement, the gains of the civil rights movement came at a price. And so many veterans that I've had the pleasure to meet kind of talked about how they never revealed their involvement in the movement with their families. So I remember Roscoe Jones very clearly, who his son didn't realize that he was a foot soldier until someone came to interview him in his 70s, right? Because it was an experience that was very traumatic for him that he could not talk about. And although his labor did create gains not only for his son and for the entire country, there was a price for that. And so again, thinking about my own family, my grandparents are from South Carolina. And they grew up in South Carolina during the 50s and 60s. And there is a chunk of time that my grandparents just don't talk about at all. For me, my understanding is that their life began at ages 18 and 19 when they moved to New York, to the Bronx to be more specific. And so my question for you, Luciana, is what has been your understanding or experience in terms of generational impact of violence and trauma?
So whenever I think about violence and trauma, I think about the body, right? I always think about the body and the impact that violence and trauma has on our bodies. And, and how trauma, almost separates us from the body, and we don't realize how trauma shows into our bodies. How do we hold on to those feelings, we hold on to those emotions, and how that, it's a form of domination that stays maintained. And I think when I think about that, I also think about how do we separate that, or how do we make sense of generational trauma? My mother, so I grew up in Brazil, and my mother, everything that she worked out for us. She comes from a family where, women were not expected to work. She was expected to get married, and but she didn't want to get married, But then at the same time, she wanted to leave the house. So then she said, "Well, I will get married," right? But at the same time, she was like, "What else can I do?" And I think there was all these histories that she was not aware of, other women that tried to leave the house, to try to work, and how they were harmed on the way of trying to leave. So, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history in São Paulo in Brazil, but it's a very patriarchal society. It's very sexist. And for her, and this was in the 50s as well. So it was not something that it was okay. And on top of that, she ended up getting divorced. And so it was divorced, and then she decided to work. And then it was kind of well, what are you doing? It's you're doing what your other women in your family try to do, but then they became harmed, but also they they were not able to take care of their families. And if you're not there for your family, you're just like making it more harm. So I think that there are things that she doesn't talk about it. There is a period of maybe 10 years that she won't talk about. And I ask her now that she's older to tell me stories, so I can understand who are the women in our family? What did they have to go through? What did they have to go through in order to be, to be able to be free sometimes? And I don't think, I can understand completely, but also there is a separation between where I came from and then being here in the United States in such a long time. But I know that there is so much that we don't talk about because we don't want to relive those memories. We don't want to think about those experiences, but also I don't think we know how to talk about. How do we talk, and I think about you with your children. How do you talk to your children about your family's experience, right? How do we talk about trauma? How do we talk about healing? And are we able to heal? Do we heal through living? Do we heal through sharing those stories, making them visible, or shifting how the stories are told? Not necessarily, through reliving the suffering. Does that make sense? And I think about when you're telling me your story of your family, I think about the James Baldwin letter to his nephew, and talking about, their family's legacy, generations, and so in a way preparing his nephew for the world, but at the same time giving him tools to never forget where he comes from.
I think as you were talking, I was thinking about my own decision to go to grad school. And the importance of education, but also thinking about the fact that academia doesn't always have all the answers, and that my story is not necessarily going to be recorded there. My family story is not going to be recorded there. And I think when I think about trauma and violence, it creates a sense of urgency, right? Like time is ticking. And I think particularly with communities of color, oral history, storytelling becomes very important. And knowing that my family has lived through some trauma, I think there's a greater urgency to capture those stories, because if not, they die with that ancestor. And so just something that I'm thinking about as you were speaking.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right, the stories are important, even through teaching. Now that you mentioned academia.
Yes.
So I teach an introduction course of gender, sexuality, and intersectionality studies. And a lot of professors, they've used textbooks in the past to teach this course. And I decided to not teach with the textbooks. Instead, I used memoirs, because these are stories of people that have lived through some of those experiences, that we can understand the power of intersectional thinking, that we can understand that racism is very much alive and well, and why these conversations that we're having are so urgent, as you said. And one of the books my students just read was the Black Lives Matter memoir. And some of my students were in class and they said, I had no idea this was real. And then I am like, no, this is real, and this is current. This is still very much happening. And another book that we read was I Hope We Choose Love, which is a trans girl's notes for the end of the world. And it's interesting when we're talking about groups that often we don't listen to the stories, or we listen some versions of those stories, how in a way we're creating not only a sense of othering, these groups, but also there is no humanization that is happening, which it needs to happen. I have students say, well, I didn't realize that in these groups, violence happens or harassment. And I'm like, let me stop you for a minute. These are human beings, and that's the problem. The way the stories are told, or the stories, if they don't become audible, if we're not listening and sharing them, we think they don't exist. And if we don't think they don't exist, we're not moving the way we should as a society. We're not understanding, one, the responsibility that we hold to one another. There is this collective responsibility we have to each other. But so often, if it's not happening here, then it means that it's not happening or it's not a problem.
Agree. So I know you mentioned that you're originally from Sao Paulo and you've been in Connecticut longer than you've been in Sao Paulo. But my next question is thinking about home. What is home for you? And to what extent has displacement shifted or maintained your sense of home?
So when I moved here, I was telling, I forgot her name, I was telling her this in 1999, and I did not speak English, and I had to go to high school. I was 17 years old, and I come home and I tell my mom in Portuguese. I said, "Mom, we're not white." And she's like, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "We're Latin, and I think we're other also," because and I still have issues with that. This idea of where are we from, but also home, but also ethnicity. What does that mean? And what does it mean that in relationship to race? But moving in here, it was a big wake-up call because suddenly I experienced some feelings that I never had before. I had never felt other the way I felt when I moved here, and I still do. I still do, especially now being in academia. Especially now, navigating certain territories, it's very difficult. When I first got divorced, that was another problem as well. But going to what home means, to me, home is where your community is. I don't think of Brazil as my home. And for many reasons. One, I think I never really felt a sense of community in São Paulo. Because if you don't know, São Paulo is a big city, like New York City. So you don't, it's not, I live in New Haven. So I can walk in the street and I can see people that I know. I can go into the grocery store and I see someone that I know. I never experienced that in São Paulo. Never. So, but I never experienced a sense of community that I have here. Especially through organizing, through doing exhibitions, through doing collaborations, partnering with different organizations. So to me, home truly is where community is. It's not necessarily a place. It's not where I'm from. I think where my community is.
Was there one particular moment where you realized, okay, this is home?
Yes. I think it was in 2016, actually, when I did the first Nasty Women exhibition. And first of all, I took a huge chance. And I thought people were going to laugh at me. I was never going to be respected in the art world. But I was so desperate. And I just could not do anything. The world that was changing, my personal life crumbling in my head. And then I'm like, well, but I'm just an artist. And then I saw this open call in New York City. And it was a group of curators and artists doing an open call for a Nasty Women exhibition. And then I went to the website and they said, we invite every single person to start their very own Nasty Women exhibition in their communities because our voices are a lot stronger if we work together. And I was like, well, that must not be that hard, right? But it was very hard. But so I decided to send an email. I sent a massive Facebook message to maybe 30 people that I knew, and I clicked send saying, I want to do this. I don't know how, but I think something needs to change. We need to do something. And I think it was very much of a time where people were feeling that they wanted to belong. They wanted to feel that they could do something. So I think there was this need to find a platform for inclusion, a platform for resistance, a platform where people could share their voices freely without feeling judged, and it didn't matter where they were coming from. But the thing is, you can put an idea out there, you can do an open call, and people still won't show up. So you're taking a risk, you're putting your name, and you're putting time. But then two different girls reached out to me, and they were like, I have a space. And another one was like, I have some experience curating. We will help you make this possible. So the three of us got together, and then we launched this call. And before you know, we had over 300 artists from across the country submitting works of art for us. But the majority of the artists were all in New Haven. So on March 8th, the exhibition opens, and we have over 1,000 people show up. And the city stopped. Like, nobody can drive in New Haven, nothing. There's like lines and lines and lines out the door. Some people had to turn around because they couldn't get in the exhibition. And it was amazing because I had people there, they were like coming to me and say, I made a piece for the show with my daughter because we just wanted to like create something because we were so scared of what's happening with the political climate. We're so scared of what can happen. And I think there was this need to gather, to come together. And so that was the time that I experienced community. That was the first time. And every year that I do this exhibition, I experience that again, you know, and I do think gathering is a really important form of, you know, community building, but also as a form of praxis. So
definitely sounds like a very beautiful healing experience. And so in terms of thinking about your art and praxis, is that, would you say that doing the Nasty Movement exhibition, is that kind of the healing that you look for on a yearly basis? Are there other moments that stand out to you?
I definitely look forward in the yearly exhibitions, and I think it's because the way it happens so organically, it's always like a response to what's happening. You know, it's always like, how do we do this? How do we create an opportunity? And people are looking forward to it. Every year. They're like, what are we doing? What are we doing? But I think another way is they said, find healing. I think whenever I'm with my family, with my kids, I think, knowing that I wouldn't be doing this work, probably if I wasn't a mother, you know? And I think that's the thing, you know, I think, I don't think sometimes we realize we're responsible for each other. And but being a mother, I realize that every single day, you know, that I can't just sit around and do nothing. You know, I have these two beings, they're looking at me every day to understand what it is a mother, you know, what is a woman, what is, like, who is this person? Like, you know, I am their role model. And so everything I do, it is thinking about them. And so it's definitely how I find healing, but also I find a purpose to be here as well.
I'm only 10 months in, but I will say they change you. They change you, they change how you move in the world. And a lot of the decisions that you make all comes back to them. So
it's true. I mean, I think we'll go through everything and anything for them. And I think that goes back to when we think about, you know, the women that are at war.
Yes.
It's like there is, when I first gave, I mean, not that this becomes a conversation about motherhood, but, you know, when I first had my daughter, I remember thinking to myself, I have never felt such love and such fear at the same time. You know, a fear that I couldn't protect her, and a love that terrified me, you know, because I barely knew this being. So,
thank you. So a lot of the drawings and sketches in this exhibition, for me, I think of sketches as something that happens very quickly with limited time, right? And so, and also limited resources.
Sure.
And a lot of the pieces kind of read as trying to process a multitude of feelings and expressions, and sometimes confusion. And so they're not polished. Some of them seem rushed. And so the show also features a lot of photography. And so I think about how some of these photographs kind of convey that same feeling as the drawings and sketches. And so as a female photographer, what do you look to capture in the context of violence?
You know, it's funny. I don't think I choose to capture violence. You know, And I think that as a photographer, I always try to think about what is it that I want people to see? What spaces I want them to imagine re-entering, or looking again, and how am I having their gaze suddenly either be challenged or be invited to see something they hadn't seen before. Through my motherhood series, it's like often I was always walking in the woods. I was always hiking with my children, but there were these very solitary walks. So I make these really large landscapes in a forest, and sometimes you see a child in the distance, sometimes you see a branch, and then you see also a figure that looks like it could be a child. Sometimes the path is like the same you've seen before, but it's empty. They also are very melancholic, those images. And because I think about all those sentiments were things that I was feeling while navigating this new part of my life. So I wanted to invite people to enter these spaces as I was photographing them, as I was also entering, to invite them to look at it through the same lens. But yeah, I think I'm less interested in showing violence. I'm more interested in showing things that it would challenge people, but also in ways that not giving in into violence. I almost don't want to, I think about the paintings, how the faces of the soldiers, those are all like erased, how they're not giving detail, not giving emphasis, and how, I think it's okay to not give violence a face.
So my last question is, there is a gendered dislocation of information between what is happening in location versus what we get to know through media outlets. And so, for example, many of the works in the exhibition heavily use the color red. Some have scratching out of genitalia, alluding to sexual violence that is often a tool of political violence. So what are silences that women are experiencing that we are not able to perceive from the U.S.?
What is it? Can you say that again, the last line? Sorry.
What are the silences that women are experiencing that we are not able to perceive from the U.S.? Because earlier you were talking about kind of how if it's not happening here and if it's not happening to us, then it doesn't exist. And so I wonder through kind of your work as a professor, as an artist, other artists that you've worked with, kind of what are some of these silences that women are thinking about in addition to the Ukrainian war?
Right. Well, it's funny that you mentioned the color red, and right now we have a lot of, in our exhibition, we have a lot of works of art that do have the color red, and I think the color red has such different meanings. It can mean rage, it can mean sometimes passion, it can mean, sometimes we think about blood, we think about, female energy. And I think sometimes I'm thinking about actually the first images of the war that I saw when they came to the media, and a lot of the images that I remember seeing of I saw young people, and I remember seeing a lot of images of actually young couples and people choosing to get married in the middle of the war. So I think about how do we think about the images that are coming to the United States, and I remember seeing a mix of them. I remember seeing a lot of violence towards women, especially mothers. I think I don't know if everybody remembers, there was this iconic photograph, which was a mother pregnant, stretched on a
stretcher.
On a stretcher, yeah. And it was the whole building around her, it was completely falling apart. It was just, and she was just there, And I struggle with the image because there was not only a dehumanization of the body, of the pregnant body, but there was also an objectification of the body as well, as being disposable, as not being important, as not mattering. And thinking through the exhibition, I see the color red also being used in ways of showing both caging, but also showing trauma in different parts in different ways, and how do we, think about trauma in relationship to violence, but also like how, war, violence that happens against women, like from rape, from murder, from like, and I don't think we actually are seeing half of what is happening, and especially right now. So I worry that I don't think we are getting sometimes the full story, and I think that's why it's important that we're listening from the people that are in those regions, that are living those experiences, and that I think it will become harder and harder, as some of those communications and some of those channels becomes less available to us in the United States.
Thank you. At this time, I want to thank you again, Luciana, for this very beautiful discussion. And I just kind of want to highlight some of the gems that you dropped for us. So I think, as we were talking, thinking about the political versus the personal, the importance of organizing when thinking about art and representation, the importance of changing the gaze, thinking about storytelling, who was telling the story, and thinking about the academy and the fact that the academy often is the holy grail, or is kind of used to verify what is true and what is not, right? But then the importance of also thinking about oral histories and the stories that people on the ground hold as being very important. The importance of survival. What does it mean to survive and resist in a war as a woman? Thinking about radical mothering, right? Even as you were talking, I was thinking about Assata Shakur and how for her, so much of her mothering informed her organizing, right? Where you have another woman like Elaine Brown, who was also a Black Panther, and at the one point where she is tasked with leading the Black Panthers, very much felt that like mothering was getting in the way of the work that she had to do. Really interesting.
It takes a village, that's for sure.
Yes. And luckily she did have a village of women who could support her as she mothered and both led this organization.
Right. And also mothering is a form of care too. I think and I thinking about the Panther movement, I think the women, they're really like having like that care system as well to make sure that, change can happen, the organizing can happen, so sometimes mothering is happening through caring.
I think also thinking about the body and kind of the importance of artists or makers or shakers to respond to what's happening now. And so I hope that last point is something I hope that we all walk away with. How do we respond to what's happening right now in this moment? So again, thank you. And at this time, I want to open up the floor for questions. I guess I would just ask that you project so that everyone can hear the question, and we'll do our best. Yes.
So, obviously, you're a well-traveled woman, right? How do you think women's stereotypes are different in Brazil versus the U.S., or anywhere they've been to, really, versus the U.S.? Because I know, like, cultural differences, like, there's just so many cultural differences, so what similarities and differences have you picked up?
That reminds me when I first moved here and I told people that I was from Brazil, and that they said to me, "Oh, so you samba? Do you like, So I would get that question, or I was asked like, "Oh, so do you have technology?" And I remember like being really surprised and thinking like, wow, there's a lot that people might not know about Brazil. But I had an experience with my father. So my parents are divorced. And then that was the first time I realized the stereotypical difference between being an American, moving here, and then what was expected out of my culture in Brazil. So there is a big emphasis on how do you look, how do you present yourself, right? There was one of the largest numbers of like plastic surgery is actually in Brazil. It's known for plastic surgery. Cesarean births are on demand because, and you don't go there on your time. It's like on the doctor's schedule. But I remember I had been living here for 5 years, and I love wearing flats. You know, this is probably the most heel you ever see me wearing. Almost every person, and my mother is one of them, they are always wearing heels, always. They're always impeccable from head to toe. And I go to a Christmas party that my father is throwing with his wife, and they're visiting. They are here in Connecticut, and they are throwing this party, and I show up to the event, and I have like a black dress like this, and I have some black flats. And my father looks at me and he says to me, "Why aren't you dressed up?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, you have this dress that it's kind of like soft and loose, and look at your shoes." And then I looked around, and every single woman had like very tight dresses, and they had heels, and I was realizing that I was expected to look in a certain way, that I was expected to be presented in a certain way, and anything outside of that was not okay. I think like some of the stereotypes that I've noticed too is that I think that was one of the biggest ones, but I think so much of it is also from the individual, you know, but I think that's one of the things I've noticed is like, how do you present yourself? And I felt more comfortable to be myself and be comfortable in how I present, how I dress than I would back home.
So you were saying that being from a different country, you had your own sort of like individual expectations?
From my culture, from my father, from my family, yes.
Okay, to dress a certain way or to be a certain person.
Right.
Okay.
My parents, just so y'all know, they do not like what I do. They do not approve of me doing a degree in women's and gender studies or teaching it or doing organizing. They don't hear any of those words. They hear professor, they hear award, they don't hear anything else. Feminism, nothing.
Does that affect your job and what you do in your life? Like the culture, like here? I know some families, they expect their kids to be like lawyers, doctors, you know.
Yes.
So is there a sort of path that Brazilians have to take, you know? Like is there a path that you were expected to take?
I think there's a part of it that there's some fear of the work I do. So this work, it's not as acceptable, it's not as easy to do it in São Paulo. Okay, like activism, a lot of it, sometimes it means a death sentence of the kind of work that you do. You know, there is a history of a dictatorship, a militarism, and it's very much still happening in there. So I don't think I do the work for the approval of my family anymore. I think I do the work for myself, for my community, for my children, and because I can't imagine doing anything else. So I think, this is for anybody that is thinking what they want to do for a career, I think you should do what you want to do. Do not try to please people, you know, with your career, because it's not gonna happen. It's not a good thing.
And I would say to think about intersections, right? So I think about for myself, the most salient identity markers for me is that I am Black, that I am queer, and that I'm a woman. Mm-hmm. And for me, I feel race first, before I feel my gender, and then I feel my sexual identity. Because I am feminine presenting, most people do not know that I am in a same-sex marriage until I tell them. Mm-hmm. And I also think about my experience outside of the US, right? I think people notice a tall Black woman first, notice that I'm Black before I am woman. But then I also think about nation and the ways that my accent has saved me, that my accent has given me a different experience in another country. I can think of a particular moment that I will never forget, where I was studying abroad in Italy. My junior year here, I went to Florence, and I was trying to find my photography class in the middle of the city, and I come across this couple. I didn't know that they were English and not. I heard them speak English. That's what it was. And so I walked up to them, and I was like, excuse me. And they were like, we don't want to buy anything from you. And I was like, I'm just trying to find my class. And she said, oh, you're American. Oh, sorry, dear. I don't know where this building is. And in that moment, it was like, oh, wow. And I had to think about my blackness in a different way. And I mean, as an American, as a Black American, I'm always thinking about race, but I had to think about race differently in that space because a lot of the Black people that were in Italy at the time were refugees from Northern Africa. And a lot of them were in situations where they did have to sell things on the street. And so I think it's not just about being a woman and cultural expectations, it's about the intersections of many identities. Whether it's your sexuality, which I know in Black culture is a taboo topic. We're getting better. But so again, thinking about womanhood, sexuality, gender, race, how these all intersect to create a very particular experience.
Right, and I think it's expectations, right? What are the expectations they have? Or like, well, what is woman? What is a woman supposed to be like? You know, and what do we, and
you're not, I mean, for me, it's not that you're marrying another woman, right? So, yeah. Oh, sorry, yes.
I was just kind of curious, how do women's rights compare to that of Brazil, to America? Are they stricter, are they looser, or do you find that it is more fair over in America?
You know, I've been here since I was 17, and I experienced very little of the women's movement in Brazil. But from what I've seen since I've been here, I felt a freedom to speak in ways that I wouldn't be able to do it in Brazil. Also, my parents would be terrified of me getting killed in a protest. And I've done protests in New Haven. I've done protests at the Capitol. I have marched and staged the die-ins, all sorts of things, and they have not, you know, and at no point I actually have felt unsafe. And I think that's a privilege that I've experienced from being here, you know. But also from the community, because I also learned that there's some things you don't want to do it alone, because that's another thing. White supremacy wants you to single people out, so they want you to work on your own. So that's why collective organizing is really important, because they can't single people out.
Do they try to shut women's rights down in Brazil? Like that's something that is like you get stoned or thrown in jail for?
Well, you don't get stoned. You just disappear. You know, or they find you murder. Yeah, so it's unfortunate. And I think that's something that I've been debating with. Even, I'm currently applying for PhDs, and I'm thinking about how do I do this work in Brazil? How do I go back? And I don't have the answer. I don't know how to do it yet.
Yeah, I've got one question. And I think it's for both of you. You brought up some very important points with your being Black, your being a woman, your being gender different or queer. You're, again, an immigrant. You're a woman, you're a mother, and, you know, as from a male point of view, you know, it's like stereotypical, you know, white guy of a certain age. But I'm also a husband, I'm a brother to a sister, I'm a grandfather to a granddaughter, father to a daughter, as well as sons. You know, how do we, you know, what do we do to support, you know, your, whatever you are, you know, and your particular cause and interests, you know, your rights to be, you know, from being that other person, you know, what can we do? What voice can we have? Sometimes I think, you know, do I even have a right to speak, you know, to or of your concerns or yours, you know, not being you, and you know, what advice, you know, it's like, you know, help me, you know, to work. to work towards that or understand better. I think a lot of us, we're at a loss for, what we can do, even though we feel compelled to do so.
I always think about showing up, I think, how are you showing up, for folks when, right now we have Roe v. Wade being overturned and there are protests happening everywhere. So how are you showing up to those spaces? Also, as someone who has, who works at a university, what kind of voices are you bringing into the university? What kind of conversations are you having with your children? And I think there's so many ways to advocate, to think about what allyship means, but also how you hold some privileges that we don't. So your voice sometimes will be heard before ours. Mm-hmm. So how you can use your voice, to advocate for those that are not like you in spaces there are only people like you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, along the same lines, I was going to say, how do you use your voice when women aren't around? But also, how do you hold members of your community accountable? How do you, do you call them out? So we're going into holiday season, and there can be some questionable conversations that take place at the dinner table, right? Do you just let Auntie so-and-so say some off-the-wall stuff, or do you call her out?
Or my son, or my brother.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Or do you sit in silence? How do you give voice to the voiceless, to those who are absent? I think that is the role that...
We shouldn't be hesitant or afraid to express our offense.
No.
At, these micro or obvious transgressions.
Because it's not about speaking for us, it's speaking up for us when we can't.
Mm-hmm. And that's probably one of the most powerful ways. It's when the people are not in the room, when you are elevating those voices, still there. Thank you for asking.
So we are over time. So I want to again thank Luciana for joining us today. And thank you all for attending this conversation on the exhibition Women at War.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.